Press Conference, a series in which people who make the news answer, impromptu, questions from men who write the news. The questioners this evening are H.B. Hodson of the Sunday Times, Ed Newman of the National Broadcasting Company of America, Kenneth Harris of the Observer, and Francis Williams, who begins the program.
Good evening and welcome again to Press Conference. This evening we are very glad to have in the studio with us Mr. Hugh Gaitskell, the leader of the Labour Party. And indeed, Mr. Gaitskell, we are very glad to have you here and to have the chance of putting quite a lot of questions to you in what I hope will be a pretty hot engagement. And I'm going to begin by asking Kenneth Harris here to fire the first shot in that engagement.
Now, Mr. Gaitskell, rightly or wrongly, a great many people in the country have got it into their heads that between August the 2nd and August the 14th, you made a very great change of mind about Suez. Is that so?
No, that isn't so. I think if you read my speech of August the 2nd, you'll find that I took two lines in it. I said, on the one hand, that what NASA had done was open to the gravest objection, and I didn't mince my words about it. But I did also say, and say very plainly indeed, that this was not a matter which, in my opinion, so far justified force, and that in any event we should not use armed force in conflict with the United Nations Charter. Now, frankly, that is the line we have taken, and I have taken all the way through.
But Mr. Gaitskell, perhaps it was the emphasis that changed.
Yeah.
In your first speech, all your emphasis was on somehow stopping Nasser. By September 13th, the last Suez debate, you said we must not let Nasser get away with it entirely. In your first speech, you talked about prestige and the struggle for the mastery of the Middle East. By the 13th, you were not talking about him anymore. In your first speech, you said there was a parallel with Hitler. In your last speech, you denied it.
No, no, that's not fair, if I may say so. I said in my first speech that he talked like Hitler, and I repeated that in my last speech. But I said we mustn't draw the conclusion from this that the position is exactly the same as it was in 1936 or 37 or 38. But I don't want to stop all the questions, but I must just say this. I think I know the explanation for this, and it is that in the August the 2nd debate, we were all of us, I think, much more concerned with what NASA had done than we were with what was to be done about it. And in fact, at that time, the government had given no clear indication of what their line was to be apart from the conference, which of course we accepted. But immediately after August the 2nd, if you look at the press, you will find that stories emerged, and they clearly came from government sources, that the British and French governments intended to impose a solution by force. I was very shocked when I saw this, because it was not the impression I had had on August the 2nd, and it was, of course, in complete conflict with what I had said myself in that debate.
Mr. Gaitskell, I think you actually said on August the 2nd that the situation was familiar. It was the kind of situation that we had before the war with Hitler and Mussolini.
No.
You didn't say that?
No.
We have the Hansard here.
You said it is all. You said, Mr. Gaitskell, it's all very familiar. It's exactly the same that we accounted.
That's right. I think you will be right in saying it's all very familiar. I was referring to the words used by NASA.
No, sir, but perhaps we've gone on that as far as we should.
Well, I think I picked it up.
In any case,
I can produce Hansard and credit to you, but I would say this. I'm almost sure that I quoted what Mr. Mollet had said about Nasser's speech. I quoted what Nasser had said about his Arab empire and so on, and I then said, and it is, I wish to make that quite plain. I think the kind of language Nasser used, and I repeated this in the September the 13th debate, is reminiscent of Hitler. But the situation, nevertheless, is not the same.
Mr. Gaitskell, I think we could follow you on that, because we have the advantage of Hansard, and as you haven't, perhaps it isn't fair to pursue it.
No, by all means pursue it.
There's another point in that debate where I'd like to take you up. And that is your statement that you did not object to the military precautions taken by the government.
Quite true.
Do you still hold to that line, that you do not object to the military precautions taken by the government?
No, I think the government were perfectly entitled, as a matter of precaution, to take certain military action. Now, of course, I didn't know exactly what it was at the moment. I don't even know exactly what it is now. So long as that is precaution and in self-defense against the danger of attack.
Well, you'd agree it has not been used, nor have the government ever
threaten, nor has any statesman threatened to use it in any other way.
Well, that depends what you mean exactly. You see, it's quite true, and I've said this myself, that the government themselves have never in any open public statement said this. But Mr. Hodson, you know very well, and I'll quote your own paper against you on this, that in fact the press got these stories from the Foreign Office or 10 Downing Street. They began really in earnest on August the 3rd, that it was the intention of the government and the French government as well, when the Suez conference, the London conference was over, if Nasser didn't accept the conclusions, the majority conclusions, to impose them by force. I'm going to take you up again in your own paper, because I happen to have, knowing you were going to be on this, to refresh myself about your leading articles. Yeah. And I'll remind you of this. On July the 29th, that's the Sunday after Nasser's action, you said in your leader, and you probably wrote it yourself, force is neither right nor necessary. But a week later, following the lead given by the government in the meanwhile, you were saying the conclusions of the conference must be pushed through by every possible means, including force, if necessary.
If necessary.
Certainly. But it wasn't necessary on July the 29th. You changed in the meanwhile, and you changed because the government had changed, and you follow the government.
Do you think there is any grounds at all for the what seems to be rather a government plea at the moment, that they went much further in force than they perhaps would otherwise have done, because your original speech had given them the idea that they had a united country behind them, which in found later they found they hadn't?
Well, Mr. Williams, after all, it's fair, I think, for me to say you must take that speech as a whole. It's no use picking out one bit and saying, you said this. I said, on the one hand, I thought Nasser had done wrong, and I'm prepared to accept this by everything I said then. But I also said, quite emphatically, that what he had done, in my opinion, so far did not justify force, and that force should only be used in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, and that we must not get ourselves in the position where we would be denounced as aggressors.
Mr. Gaitskell, since you've put me in the box, may I say I also stand by what has appeared in Sunday Times editorials, and secondly, that they are not written under guidance or instruction from the government.
Well, let's say you were a bit influenced by what had come out in the previous week.
Nothing that was said there, and I want to make this clear because I'm sure this is a point on which we will agree, indicates that force should be used in defiance of or contrary to the covenant of the Charter of the United Nations. There may be a difference of opinion as to what the Charter of the United Nations authorises or even enjoins.
Mr. Hudson, I'm glad to welcome you over to the Labour benches.
Mr. Gaitskell, would you say that not you yourself, but some people in the Labour Party and perhaps some people on the fringes of it have tended, as the crisis has developed, to put a purely synthetic halo round Nasser because they were critical of the government's policy?
Well, there are perhaps a few people who are, I would say, rather too pro-Nasser and don't realise the danger that he is and can be. But I want to say quite emphatically that we have a two-party system, and of course each party has people with different points of view. If I may say so, thank goodness that is so. It would be a very dull affair if everybody was exactly taking the same line all the time. But I would say this, and you know the Labour Party as well as anybody, it's a long time since I recollect the party is so completely and naturally united on an issue. You could take, if you like, German rearmament as something which was natural to divide the Labour Party, and it did. We all know that. This is, as it were, natural to unite the Labour Party. They are perfectly clear, I think, the overwhelming majority, that what Nasser has done was wrong, that he may be a danger, but they're equally clear that what he has done does